In our supplemental readings this week, there is a paper led by Michelle Ward that looked at the state of connectivity in the Global Protected Areas Network. In this video, we will dig into their results and take a deeper look at the state of connectivity in the Canadian Protected Areas system. As we've been talking about, connectivity between protected areas is important for a number of different reasons. A well-connected landscape is generally a sign of healthier ecosystems where natural processes are able to function without disruption. It also allows for wildlife movement to occur, helping to maintain genetic diversity among populations and allowing species to move to the resources they need or to migrate as either part of their natural life cycle or because of climate change-related pressures. The importance of connectivity is also recognized in a number of global conservation agreements, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Aichi targets. Aichi Target 11 was the 2020 target to protect at least 17% of the Earth's terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas. But the 17 and 10% shouldn't just be any area. The target also makes some qualitative stipulations about the protected areas system, including the fact that it should be well connected. While there has been a lot of focus on how well the quantitative elements of the target have been met, the status of the qualitative elements are less understood. So far, reporting on the effectiveness of protected areas has not dealt with how well connected the rapidly growing protected areas system is. When countries submit their reports to the Convention on Biological Diversity, they generally focus on the quantitative part of the target. For example, in Canada's sixth report to the Convention, which was published in 2018, the status of the quantitative targets are discussed in detail, but as for the qualitative elements, the report simply states that, quote, "These elements are all considerations in Canada's broader approach to biodiversity conservation, and efforts are underway to continue to address these elements. Most, with the exception of representativity, are not consistently monitored across the country," end quote. Now, this isn't an uncommon statement to find in these reports to the Convention, so in the paper led by Michelle Ward, the authors took on a spatial assessment of the world's protected areas system in order to assess the level of connectivity and attempt to start to quantify the progress towards this part of Aichi Target 11. What they did was analyze the structural connectivity of the global protected areas system based on the contiguity of intact land, or land that is relatively free from human influence between protected areas. The assumption was that species will be able to move freely between protected areas through intact land. This means that the results likely underestimate the connectivity of the protected areas system from the functional perspective of most species, because most species are able to move through altered landscapes at least over a short distance. However, their analysis would do a good job at predicting the connectivity of the network for the most sensitive species which are unable to cope with human-dominated landscapes. They found that while a little over 40% of the global terrestrial area is intact, only 9.7% of the protected areas is considered to be structurally connected through intact landscapes. In other words, very few protected areas have a fully continuous pathway through intact lands connecting them to another protected area. How well the protected area system is connected varies by country and by continent. By continent, protected areas in Oceania are the most well connected, with some countries in the region, namely Kiribati, French Polynesia, and the Solomon Islands, having 100% of their protected areas system connected. In contrast, the protected areas of Europe are the least connected, with less than half of 1% of the protected areas on the continent being connected, and most countries on the continent having no connections between their protected areas whatsoever. To bring it back to Aichi Target 11, very few countries or territories have met the target of at least 17% terrestrial protection and have at least 50% of that protected area connected. In fact, only 9 countries and territories have met both of these measures, which are shown here on the map in green. Interestingly, the authors found no significant relationship between the countries or territories with high proportions of connected protected land and the number of protected areas or the size of the country or territory. This suggests that countries may not be considering structural connectivity when they add to their protected areas system. This may be for a few different reasons. In countries or territories where there are more intact landscapes, there may be fewer but larger protected areas being established. And in more human-modified countries and territories, there may be many smaller protected areas being established, but they are surrounded by a human-modified matrix. The authors also point out that there are plenty of opportunities to increase the connectivity between the global protected areas network. Specifically, they point out 18 countries that have more than 50% intact landscapes, yet have very low connectivity between their protected areas. For example, Egypt is 77% intact landscapes, yet only 11% of its protected areas system is connected. Similarly, 69% of Russia is intact landscapes, but only 4% of their protected areas are connected. Opportunities to increase connectivity within the protected areas system is often limited, as most countries and territories have few intact landscapes remaining and low proportions of connected protected areas, suggesting that massive restoration efforts may be essential to creating the well-connected protected areas network that global conservation targets call for. Let's take a bit of a deeper look at the connectivity of the Canadian protected areas system. Overall, about 12% of the terrestrial and inland water area of Canada is protected, which is shown here in blue. Outside of protected areas, green indicates intact landscapes and yellow are modified ones. Overall, the authors of our reading found that about 23% of protected areas here are connected. Looking at this map, we can see that most of the protected areas in Canada that are connected through intact landscapes are in the north and in the mountainous regions of Western Canada, where there are fewer human pressures on the landscape. There is a bit of a disconnect between where Canadian protected areas are and where the bulk of the population lives. Specifically, there are few protected areas in southern Ontario and Quebec, and those that are there tend to be small and disconnected, meaning that the ecosystems of the Carolinian and Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests are underrepresented in the protected areas system, and the disconnected nature of the protected areas in the region will likely create problems for species that try to migrate north out of the United States as climate change pushes them over the border. There are a number of challenges to increasing connectivity across the global protected areas network. One challenge is that there are multiple jurisdictions planning and managing protected areas. In some cases, national borders mean that protection suddenly ends, but there are some good examples of coordinated conservation efforts across borders that we will hear about later this week. Even within a country or territory, there may be multiple jurisdictions planning and managing protected areas. So a lack of structural connectivity may be occurring simply because of a lack of coordination between jurisdictions. Therefore, there is a need for federal, Indigenous, provincial, and municipal governments, as well as private and NGO conservation organizations, to coordinate their efforts to ensure connectivity between protected areas. In some cases, though, protected areas are already highly isolated in a highly altered landscape, so there is a need for a broad restoration agenda to rapidly increase connectivity between protected areas. The United Nations has declared this decade to be the decade on ecosystem restoration, with the broad goal of restoring 350 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. The authors of the paper, led by Michelle Ward, argue that these efforts should be specifically targeted to focus on rebuilding connectivity between protected areas. However, even with extensive restoration efforts, many protected areas will remain unconnected, highlighting the importance of broad-scale landscape management and managing the full landscape in a manner that is compatible with biodiversity conservation. Ultimately, even if the 2030 targets for protected areas are met, 70% of the world will remain unprotected, and that 70% will matter a lot in terms of how well connected the protected areas estate is. There is also a need for a clear reporting framework that captures not just the extent of protected areas, but also their connectivity. As previously mentioned, IG Target 11 gives a quantitative target for protected areas and then states that they should be well connected. The Ward et al. Paper in our supplemental readings could be the basis for a framework that could be used at the national level by governments to evaluate the connectivity of their protected area systems.